Robb Stark stood on the battlements of Riverrun at dusk, watching the Tully banners flutter beside his own direwolf standard. Below the walls, the red-orange glow of torchlight played over the waters of the Tumblestone, sending shimmering reflections across the dark river. The air smelled of rain-soaked stone and fresh greenery, for the long summer still clung to the Riverlands despite the stirrings of war. Men hustled to and fro along the inner ward, checking gates, preparing for the night. Within the great hall, the Tullus had lit feasting fires for the lords sworn to House Stark. But Robb, the newly crowned king in the north, found no solace in warm fires and hearty meals these days. His father was dead, executed by the Lannisters in King's Landing. His sisters were at the mercy of the Iron Throne. And yet here he stood, bearing the mantle of kingship none had expected him to claim at his age. There was an unspoken heaviness between him and the men who called him Your Grace. They saw a boy, but they also saw something more. A spark of Ned Stark's steady honor, Catelyn Tully's unwavering devotion, and a wolf's cunning that had surprised the realm. He was not the carefree son of Winterfell any longer. The war had carved away innocence and left in its place the unyielding hardness of necessity. He gazed out over the walls, recalling how the war had begun with his father's arrest in King's Landing, how the North had rallied behind him, how he had led swift forays against the Lannisters, host upon host falling to his strategic brilliance. Yet for all the victories he had racked up, every success felt hollow without his sisters safe, without justice for Ned Stark. And so he lingered, letting the last rays of sun fade into twilight, wishing for a reprieve the gods would not grant. Somewhere to his right, he heard the rustle of cloaks and recognized the measured footsteps of his mother, Lady Catelyn Stark. She moved gracefully despite her weary heart, her red hair braided and tucked beneath a thick shawl embroidered with both the direwolf of House Stark and the fish of House Tully. There was kindness in her voice, but also quiet steel. "Robb," she said softly, "it's late. You should come inside." He turned, regarding her with a faint smile. The torches lit the blue of his eyes, made them look sharper, older. "I needed a moment. The men look to me as if I have all the answers. I'm not certain I do." She placed a comforting hand on his armored shoulder. "You have done well for them. Do not doubt that. The Freys, the Mallisters, the Blackwoods, they all admire you. Your father would be proud." His jaw set for a moment, that wave of grief passing through him. He whispered, "I hope so." Then he cleared his throat and tried to focus on the present. "Is there news from our outriders?" "Lord Roose Bolton's scouts have returned," Lady Catelyn replied, voice low but urgent. "They bring word that a certain royal party is moving through the region, escorted by a contingent of Lannister men. They did not expect to find them so far from the safety of their main host." Robb frowned. "Royal party? Who would be foolish enough to venture this close to our lines?" His mother hesitated. "They believe it is King Joffrey himself, traveling under heavy guard, though not as large a guard as you might expect. Perhaps it is arrogance or a trap laid out for us. Their direction is uncertain, but there are rumors they wanted to circumvent our usual scouting lines. Possibly they wished to treat with Walder Frey. Possibly they wanted to move quickly without attracting attention." A slow, disbelieving shake of his head. "Joffrey here? If that is true..." He let the words trail off. The possibility was staggering. This was the boy who had commanded the execution of Ned Stark, the Lannister puppet who now wore the crown and called himself rightful ruler of the Seven Kingdoms. That boy's actions had shattered Robb's family. If by chance Joffrey was in the Riverlands, exposed and vulnerable, the advantage could be enormous. A cold part of Robb's mind recognized the strategic opportunity. If he captured Joffrey, all negotiations would be on his terms. The king in the north might have a real chance to recover Sansa and Arya. He might even wrest the entire north from the Iron Throne's dominion. But with that thought came old lessons, the sense of Ned Stark's caution in his mind. "We have to confirm it," Robb said quietly. "We cannot throw men away on a rumor." Lady Catelyn nodded. "Roose Bolton's men are preparing to shadow the Lannister party at a distance. If it truly is Joffrey, they will signal us. The bigger question is, What do you plan to do if the rumor proves true? His eyes narrowed, and for a moment he looked every inch the avenging Wolf King his men had begun to whisper about. I intend to make them regret that foolishness, he replied. The boy may think he is a lion, but outside the Red Keep, he's just prey for the wolf. The next day dawned cool and gray. The outriders rode in under the gate, horses lathered from a hard ride. Robb was in the courtyard, armed and booted, gray wind at his side, the great direwolf watching with fierce golden eyes. One of the scouts, a younger man with a deep cut along his forearm, dismounted and offered a hasty bow. Your Grace, he gasped. It's true. The boy king is but 5 leagues from here at most. The escort is not large. Word is they've taken the woodland paths to avoid detection. Robb's expression was grim delight as his eyes flicked to his mother, who hovered near. The men around them stirred, for the mention of Joffrey set them aflame with whispered curses. They hated him as the face of all their grief, the cause of Ned Stark's demise, the threat to House Stark's rightful place. One of them, a grizzled soldier who had once served in the Winterfell Guard, spat on the ground. Get the men ready, Robb commanded. Quietly, we ride within the hour. Catelyn made to speak, and he could see the concern in her eyes. Are you certain you don't want Lord Bolton's men to handle this? Or wait for additional reinforcements? He shook his head. Time is short. Every moment we delay, the Lannisters might slip away. I'll take a small force, 500 men, swift riders. Stealth will serve us better than a large host that might scare them off. She did not argue further. Though fear shone in her gaze, she knew the stakes. An opportunity like this might never come again. Instead, she placed her hand upon his arm once more. The gods be with you, my son. With that, Robb Stark descended into the yard, gray wind padding beside him. Men scrambled to gather arms and armor, to saddle horses, to fill quivers and sharpen swords. The hush of anticipation spread through the keep like a fevered hush before a fierce storm. They felt it in the air. A chance to avenge Ned Stark, to strike a blow that might shatter the Lannister hold on the throne. Still, none spoke of how capturing Joffrey Baratheon, if that was indeed who traveled these roads, might complicate the war. There was but one goal now, to take him alive, if at all possible, and make the Lannisters pay. They rode out under the pale sun, the sky overhead as colorless as beaten steel. Robb wore plate and mail, the direwolf sigil enameled on his breastplate. At his hip, he carried his sword in a worn scabbard that had once belonged to a Stark ancestor. Around him, his bannermen kept pace. Great John Umber with his loud laughter and imposing size, Ser Brynden Tully the Blackfish with his lean, efficient presence, Rickard Karstark brooding on some private vengeance of his own, and a company of young knights and archers. The plan was simple. Move swiftly, outflank the Lannister party, and cut off any escape routes. The men whispered that the old gods were smiling upon them, to set Joffrey in their sights on such an auspicious day. They found Bolton's outriders at midday near a thick stand of oak and ash. The scouts pointed across a shallow valley where a dirt road cut through low hills. Sure enough, a column of riders in crimson cloaks, led by a small but gaudy litter bearing the royal sigil, was making slow progress. Occasionally, the pale-haired figure within the litter raised his voice, and the faint echo drifted on the wind. It was hard to mistake that shrill timbre. Robb's heart hammered at the realization that, by all the evidence, it really was Joffrey Baratheon. The boy king, whose cruelty had sparked war, sat behind those lines of armor and banners, oblivious to the wolves closing in. Robb conferred with his men quickly, breath coming sharp with adrenaline. He wanted the capture to be swift, no quarter given if the Lannisters resisted. Yet it was equally vital that Joffrey himself survive. Dead, he would be valuable only as a symbol. Alive, he might be the key to saving Sansa and Arya, or to securing the North's freedom once and for all. So Robb hammered the instructions into his knights. Do not kill the boy with the golden hair. On your lives, ensure he is taken. The men nodded, eyes bright beneath the rims of their helmets. A plan took shape. The Blackfish would take archers on the left flank to cut off any flight east. Rickard Karstark would bring cavalry from the right to funnel them into the narrow gorge. Robb himself would charge straight down the center, trusting in the skill of his men. The air was taut with anticipation. Grey Wind, sensing the blood to come, prowled at Robb's side, lips curling back from fearsome fangs. They waited until the Lannisters were at the narrowest bend in the road before they revealed themselves. At Robb's signal, horns brayed from the hillside, echoing in the quiet. Then the Starks and their allies burst out of the tree line. Archers released a deadly volley that thudded into shields and mail, scattering the Lannister vanguard. Karstark's riders galloped around the flank to block their escape. Crimson cloaks whipped in sudden terror. Shouts filled the air. "Stark! The king in the north!" Men died screaming. Horses reared, panicked by the assault. The Lannisters, taken by surprise, tried to form a defensive line, but they had not the numbers nor the proper formation. Their few outriders fell beneath the swift arrows. Some turned to run, only to find their path blocked by a wall of northern steel. Robb rode at the head of his men, Grey Wind rushing ahead in a fury. Lannister swordsmen tried to stand their ground, but the direwolf leapt at them, ripping out throats, sowing terror. Robb's cavalry crashed into the disordered lines, hacking and thrusting. The thunder of hooves shook the earth. He guided his horse skillfully, parrying a spear thrust aimed at his chest, then delivering a brutal slash across his attacker's shoulder. All around him, men were shouting and dying. Still, Robb's eyes roved for the Boy King's litter. He spotted it further back, turning in a desperate bid to flee. The driver whipped the horses to a gallop, but the road was clogged with fallen men and animals. Northern riders closed in on every side, shouting for Joffrey's surrender. An arrow took the driver in the shoulder, toppling him from his seat. The litter lurched sideways, nearly overturning. From within came a frantic cry. The curtains parted, revealing Joffrey's unmistakable face. Pale, sharp-chinned, eyes wide with raw panic. He wore ornate golden armor that seemed more for show than real protection. Beside him cowered a Kingsguard knight, the white cloak stained with dust, frantically trying to shield the king from the chaos. But the advantage was with the Northmen. Swords pointed at the occupant of the litter from all sides. The Kingsguard knight tried one last stand, whirling his blade with the practiced skill of a veteran. He cut down 2 of Robb's men before an arrow pierced his thigh. Then another arrow lodged in his chest, and he fell, bloodied. Joffrey screamed, flailing, unsure what to do. Robb reined in his horse and dismounted in a single swift movement, approaching the litter. The tang of blood filled his nostrils. Around him, the last embers of resistance were snuffed out by his men. In mere moments, the Lannister escort had been overwhelmed. Grey Wind padded after him, muzzle red, hackles high. Joffrey shrank back, his face ashen, as the direwolf bared teeth in a low growl. Robb thrust his sword forward, the tip stopping inches from Joffrey's quivering throat. "Yield," said the king in the north, voice cold. Joffrey's eyes darted about for any sign of rescue that would not come. A tear slid down his cheek, his pride warring with the stark reality of death. He tried to speak, but only a whimper escaped. Seeing no alternative, he slowly raised his trembling hands in surrender. "Don't kill me," he gasped. "I am the king." Robb's jaw clenched. Here was the monster who had so casually sentenced Ned Stark to die. Yet he was nothing more than a frightened boy. The irony struck him. So much death had sprung from the whims of this trembling child. "You are my prisoner," Robb said at last, "and you will answer for what you've done." He gestured, and 2 of his men seized Joffrey by the arms, yanking him from the litter. Another soldier yanked away the golden crown that adorned Joffrey's head, leaving his blonde hair in disarray. The Boy King's breath came in ragged sobs, his lip quivering. But this was no time for mercy. Robb shoved him forward, the metal tip of the sword pressed lightly against the small of Joffrey's back. "Bind him," he ordered. The men complied, fastening Joffrey's wrists with rough rope. The hush that fell over the battlefield was profound. They had done the impossible. They had captured the Lannisters' king. In the wake of that short, brutal skirmish, the Northmen took stock of their injuries. Perhaps a score had been lost, but the Lannister casualties were far higher. More important than any count of the dead, they now had the greatest prize of the war. Robb wiped the blood from his sword and slid it home in its scabbard, though the tension within him had not eased. Victory should have felt sweeter, but the weight of his father's death pressed upon him. He stared at Joffrey, half tempted to take his head right there. But no, that would gain him nothing. He needed Joffrey alive as leverage. The boy was shaking uncontrollably, spouting pleas for his mother, threats of vengeance, half-incoherent demands. One of the Northmen cuffed him on the side of the head to silence him, and Joffrey collapsed to his knees in a whimpering heap. Robb exhaled slowly. This was war, but it still felt grotesque somehow, seeing that cowering whelp. What would Ned have done? No, he knew that answer. Ned would have tried to do the honorable thing, the just thing, while also securing what was best for his family. And that was precisely what Robb must do now. He had a chance to save Sansa, Arya, perhaps to achieve independence for the North. All of it rested on Joffrey's worthless hide. And so he had to protect the boy, ironically enough, from the very men who might like nothing more than to deliver vengeance in blood. Without ceremony, Robb and his men forced Joffrey onto a horse, binding him securely so he could not flee. Then they turned back the way they came, making for Riverrun at speed. They did not linger. Scouts rode ahead, checking for any Lannister reinforcements. They found none. Word would soon reach Tywin Lannister that his precious grandson had been captured. But for now, the Northmen had an unchallenged ride back to the safety of Riverrun's walls. All the while, Joffrey squirmed in the saddle, cursing and crying, lurching between defiance and abject terror. "My mother will kill you all," he shrieked at one point. "My grandfather will bring an army." A blow to the back of his head cut him off. "Silence," commanded Robb, cold as winter. "You would be dead if not for my forbearance. Do not test me." Joffrey subsided, glaring balefully. The traveling party pressed on, the tension still a live wire in every man. No one knew what new shape the war would take now that the king in the north held the boy king as captive. They returned to Riverrun at night, torches lining the ramparts, the gates open in welcome. The watchers on the walls gasped to see who rode with Robb's party. Word spread like wildfire. By the time they dismounted in the courtyard, a crowd had gathered, soldiers, servants, and knights, all wide-eyed with astonishment. Lady Catelyn emerged, flanked by Brienne of Tarth and Ser Edmure Tully. The question died on her lips as she recognized the ragged figure in ropes, whose fair hair gleamed in the torchlight. She lowered her voice. "Gods, you really did it." Robb nodded, handing the reins of his horse to a stable boy. Gray wind circled, letting out a low growl every time Joffrey so much as twitched. "We need to secure him. A cell, or some other safe place." Ser Edmure stepped forward, uncertain. "Put him in the dungeons?" Robb considered. "Make sure it's guarded day and night. Keep him healthy, fed, but allow him no chance of escape. He is our greatest bargaining piece." His mother nodded her agreement, and Edmure hastened to arrange it. Joffrey was hauled off, still cursing weakly, but his voice was smaller now, devoid of its typical bluster. The king in the north watched him go, the enormity of what he had done sinking in. They had not only captured Joffrey, but also brought him inside Tully's stronghold walls. Felt surreal. Now everything would change. That night, Riverrun was alive with rumors and excitement. Men came from all corners of the castle to see if the stories were true. Some wanted to rejoice, others to confirm that the vile boy who had murdered their beloved Ned Stark was indeed in chains. Some simply stared in awe at the bold stroke of fortune that had delivered the biggest prize of the war. Lady Catelyn and Robb took counsel in a private chamber, along with the Blackfish and several key bannermen. "How do we proceed?" Rickard Karstark asked bluntly. "This is a chance to force the Lannisters to heel. We have the whelp. Send terms at once. Make them release your sisters and recognize the independence of the North." The Great John rumbled in agreement, pounding a fist on the wooden table. "Aye, that and more. We should demand gold, supply lines, whatever we want. The Lannisters will kneel." Catelyn's expression was subdued. "We must be careful. Tywin Lannister is as dangerous as a cornered lion. If we back him into a corner, he might lash out in ways we cannot predict. We all remember the fate of the Riverlands under his scorched earth tactics. So far, Joffrey's mother, Queen Regent Cersei, still holds my daughters. She might order them killed rather than yield. We must ensure Sansa and Arya's safety before anything else." Silence fell. The flicker of candlelight cast long shadows across their faces. Robb braced his hands on the table. "We do not intend mercy for the Lannisters," he said, "but we must do this with cunning. We will send ravens to King's Landing informing them that Joffrey Baratheon is our prisoner. We will list our demands plainly: the safe return of my sisters, recognition of northern independence, and formal renunciation of all claims the Iron Throne holds over the North and the Riverlands. Only then will we consider releasing their king. If they refuse, we keep him until they see reason." The men exchanged glances, some nodding, some harboring doubts. The Grachan's booming voice broke the quiet. "That's well said, Your Grace. But do you think they'll agree so easily?" Robb exhaled. "No, I don't. But we have the advantage now. They can no longer claim to hold my sisters as their trump card when we hold their king. We will see how Cersei's cunning fares against that. In the meantime, we fortify. We ensure Joffrey cannot escape. We prepare for Tywin's armies, in case they come in force." They discussed further details: how many men to keep at Riverrun, how to garrison their other strongholds, how to coordinate with northern lords who might soon march south upon hearing of the capture. Through it all, Lady Catelyn was silent, hands clasped tight. Only when the others had gone did she speak softly to her son. "You know what is likely to happen, Robb. Tywin will never let this rest without blood. He is too proud, and Cersei is too cunning. We must be prepared for betrayal." Robb placed a reassuring hand over hers. "I know. We can only do our best. But we have hope now, Mother. Real hope. Sansa and Arya might be returned to us. The war may yet be ended by our terms." She managed a thin smile, though worry shadowed her eyes. "I pray you are right." Days became a tense waiting game. Ravens were dispatched, carrying Robb's demands to King's Landing. Rumors flooded in from other lords, from wandering peddlers, from every corner of the realm. Some said Tywin Lannister had flown into a rage and was gathering all his bannermen. Others claimed Queen Cersei had half lost her wits, that she wept and screamed, refusing to eat until her son was returned. Yet no official reply arrived at Riverrun, and so the waiting continued. Meanwhile, Joffrey languished in a guarded tower cell. He was provided with clean straw to sleep on, bread and meat, water and wine, but no courtesy otherwise. The guards kept him shackled at night. Outside, a pair of direwolves, Grey Wind and a smaller, younger wolf from the litter, occasionally stalked about, their presence a reminder that escape was not an option. When Robb finally visited Joffrey's cell, it was not out of any desire for conversation, but rather to see for himself that the prized captive was secure. He found the boy huddled in a corner, eyes burning with resentment. Joffrey's once pristine garments were soiled, his golden hair limp. Gone was the gilded armor, gone the illusions of grandeur. Still, that sullen cruelty flickered behind his gaze. "You dare keep me like this?" he hissed, the moment he spotted Robb. "When my grandfather hears." "Your grandfather has already heard," Robb replied calmly, arms folded. "He has done nothing to aid you yet." "He will," Joffrey spat. "You'll all pay. Everyone who's wronged me." Robb stared at him. "I remember your threats from the day you executed my father. All your talk of heads on spikes, of traitors. Tell me, do you recall how my father knelt before you, trusting in your mother's promise of mercy?" A flicker of uncertainty in Joffrey's eyes, quickly replaced by defiance. "He was a traitor. My mother said." "Your mother," Robb growled, "has lied many times, and so have you. The only difference now is that you are in chains." Joffrey's face twisted with fear and rage. "I am your king. You are no king of mine," Robb said, voice low. "Perhaps once you understand that, we'll have a civilized conversation about how to end this war. For now, I've said all I need to." With that, he turned and left the cell, his mind whirling with the injustice of it all. How had the Seven Kingdoms come to war because of this cruel, selfish whelp? The world was truly mad. Outside the cell, in the corridor, he found his mother waiting. She studied his features sympathetically. "Any revelations?" "None," he said wearily. "He's as hateful as ever. I expected no less. But remember, we need him alive." Robb nodded, though part of him rebelled at the thought. Ned's face flashed through his mind, the moment of that terrible execution. He suppressed it. The Stark's path would not be one of vengeance for vengeance's sake. He had to see this through for the sake of his sisters, his people, and for the future of an independent North. If that meant keeping Joffrey alive, he would do it. Word finally came nearly a fortnight after Joffrey's capture. A raven from King's Landing. The letter bore the seal of the hand of the king, but the writing within was clearly guided by Cersei's will. In polite yet furious language, the letter demanded Joffrey's immediate release and threatened dire consequences should any harm befall him. There was no mention of Sansa or Arya, not so much as a sentence acknowledging the Stark girls. The letter ended by proclaiming that if Joffrey was not returned, House Lannister would bring the full might of the crown to annihilate House Stark and all its allies. Robb stared at the parchment, blood boiling. The arrogance was breathtaking. They did not even bother to negotiate. They issued commands and threats, as if House Stark were some petty banner house that would cower. His mother read it as well, and a flicker of despair crossed her face. "They do not even mention my daughters," she whispered. Truly, the Lannisters care for nothing but themselves. Robb's bannermen raged at the letter, calling for immediate retaliation. The Great John demanded Joffrey's head in response. Rickard Karstark urged taking more aggressive measures, perhaps even sending outriders to harass Lannister supply lines further south. Brynden Tully, ever composed, advised caution, reminding them that Tywin's armies were large and well-funded. Robb let them vent their rage, then he quieted the room with a firm gesture. "They think to frighten us into compliance," he said. "That alone tells me how desperate they are. We will craft our reply. Let them know that if my sisters are not returned safe and unharmed, Joffrey will remain our prisoner. We also demand an official document signed and witnessed, granting independence to the North. Until that is delivered, there will be no release. If they think to quell us by threat, they are mistaken. My father once said fear cuts deeper than swords, but we have learned to overcome fear. Let us show them that the North is united." The men agreed, and another raven was dispatched. It was a precarious game. Every passing day that Joffrey remained in Stark custody was another day for the Lannisters to plan retaliation, and for the realm to fall deeper into chaos. Reports came in of restlessness in the west, of raids in the Riverlands by roving bands loyal to House Lannister. King Stannis Baratheon was said to be gathering ships at Dragonstone, and King Renly Baratheon marched with a huge southern host, both claiming the Iron Throne. The war was fracturing the Seven Kingdoms. Yet at Riverrun, the prize of Joffrey's captivity gave them leverage they had never before possessed. Catelyn visited Joffrey one day in hopes of gleaning something about her daughter's fate. He sneered at her and refused to speak her name, offering only vile insults. He was a hateful child, but he did betray certain hints when she pressed him. Sansa was alive, kept in the Red Keep as a hostage. Arya's whereabouts he did not know. Apparently she had fled the day of Ned's execution, and the Lannisters had not been able to find her. That news concerned Catelyn, but also gave her a faint spark of hope. If Arya was not in Cersei's clutches, perhaps she was still free somewhere in the city or beyond. She prayed the girl's wild nature would keep her safe, but it meant they could not rely on a formal exchange for Arya's release. The Lannisters could not trade what they did not have. And so the negotiations, such as they were, focused on Sansa and the North's independence. It fell to Robb to steer that ship. Catelyn did not envy him the burden. As the weeks wore on, the tension in the castle grew thicker. The men were restless, longing for action, while the lords debated how best to force a settlement. A few tried to urge Robb into more aggressive tactics, march on King's Landing itself with Joffrey in chains. But Robb knew such a gambit would be suicidal. King's Landing had walls, a fortress, and potentially more men if Tywin returned from the field. Instead, he sent out loyal captains to consolidate territories around the Trident, making sure the roads were blocked to any Lannister incursion. Slowly, deliberately, he tightened the noose around the Crown's supporters in the Riverlands. In response, Tywin Lannister made sharp moves westward, feinting near Harrenhal, burning villages that supported House Tully. His riders terrorized local peasants, trying to draw Robb's forces out into a pitched battle on unfavorable ground. But Robb refused to be baited. He remained at Riverrun with the bulk of his army, secure with his hostage. Each time Tywin probed, he found a well-defended pass or watchful outriders who denied him easy victory. Finally, a second letter arrived from King's Landing. This time, it was in Queen Cersei's own hand, full of fury and anguish. She raged that her beloved son was being held in squalor, threatened pain for the Starks if he was not released, but grudgingly offered to trade Sansa in exchange. She gave no word of northern independence, though. She demanded Joffrey's return first. Only then would she consider negotiations about the north. Robb's face darkened as he read her words in the presence of his council. "They treat us like fools," he growled. "They say they will hand over Sansa once Joffrey is returned, but offer no guarantee, no witness to the agreement, no mention of independence. We would be trusting the very people who butchered my father. I will not do it." The Great John slammed a fist on the table again, praising Robb's backbone. Rickard Karstark nodded grimly, supporting a refusal. Catelyn, though she longed more than anyone for Sansa's safety, knew in her heart that to accept such vague terms would be disastrous. This was precisely the kind of snare the Lannisters were infamous for. "We cannot yield, but we must at least try to keep the negotiations alive," she said. "For Sansa's sake." Robb squeezed her hand. "I will craft a response, but I will not yield on Joffrey's release until we have my sister in our care. We will propose an exchange on neutral ground, Sansa for Joffrey. Simultaneous release. As for the North's independence, we will not let that go. We have the power now." And so the letters went back and forth. Days bled into weeks, and behind each polite phrase on parchment seethed a quiet rancor. Meanwhile, Joffrey's presence in Riverrun triggered a wave of rumors throughout the Seven Kingdoms. The small folk whispered that the so-called Boy King had been shown to be a coward, that Robb Stark rode with a pack of direwolves, that the Lannisters' power was weakening. Merchants spoke of ominous signs in the capital, that the gold cloaks were on edge, that Cersei seemed unhinged, that Tywin's coffers were being drained by the massive armies he fielded. Yet still no resolution came. Each night, Robb found sleep elusive. He imagined Sansa alone in the Red Keep, frightened yet keeping a stoic face. He wondered about Arya, who was out there somewhere, perhaps, and sometimes, in the deepest hours, he asked himself if he had done the right thing in capturing Joffrey. The nights at Riverrun were filled with uneasy quiet, only the occasional croak of frogs from the riverbanks. Far in the north, he knew winter was coming. The godswood in Winterfell would be empty, the snows would be thick in the mountains, and his people would soon face the true cold. If the war dragged on, who would protect them from the winter's bite? Then, nearly 2 months after Joffrey's capture, a letter arrived sealed with a direwolf sigil. It was from some of Robb's loyal men in the capital, spies who had been planted among the merchants. They had news. Sansa had been moved from her tower chamber to a more secure location, likely under direct watch of the Kingsguard who remained. The girl was rumored to be in ill health, though that might have been an exaggeration. More importantly, the letter claimed that Tywin Lannister was no longer in the capital but had marched west with the bulk of his forces, leaving only a skeleton garrison behind. That meant King's Landing was vulnerable, and perhaps, if they moved cunningly, an exchange might be forced through before Tywin could return. Or so the letter suggested. Robb read it twice, adrenaline surging. If King's Landing had only a small garrison, could he march there and force open the gates with Joffrey in tow? His blood quickened at the possibility. But caution won out. Even a skeleton garrison in the city was formidable behind those thick walls, with scorpions and archers. And no doubt the Lannisters had left cunning men behind. Yet the news was not without value. They might find a way to approach the city with a small force, orchestrate the exchange in a controlled setting. The risk, of course, was that Cersei could decide to kill Sansa at the last moment or attempt some ruse to free Joffrey without fulfilling her part. At council that evening, Robb presented the plan he had formed. We propose a meeting on the outskirts of King's Landing, near the old farms by the Blackwater Rush. We bring Joffrey with a contingent of my best men. Cersei brings Sansa. There, we perform the exchange. As soon as Sansa is safely in our hands, we release Joffrey. If they attempt a double-cross, we will threaten to kill him. We must do this swiftly, before Tywin returns to the city. The men at the table absorbed the idea. Some were uneasy. It's dangerous, Brynden Tully said. But it might be our only chance to see Sansa freed. Rickard Karstark nodded agreement, though he looked as though he wanted more than simply a hostage exchange. The Great John was skeptical but did not oppose. Catelyn was as tense as a drawn bowstring, knowing how many things could go wrong. Yet she saw no other path if they wished to save Sansa. The Lannisters were not budging on independence otherwise. They refused to speak of it as long as Joffrey was in chains. If they could at least secure Sansa, that would be something. The Raven was sent. Days passed without reply. Then it came. Cersei, in short, grudging sentences, agreed to a meeting. She named a location, a stretch of farmland a league from the city gates. She said she would bring Sansa. The exchange would happen at midday on an appointed date. No more than 100 men on each side. No traps. If Joffrey was harmed, Sansa's life would be forfeit. If Sansa was not turned over, Joffrey would remain a captive. The letter ended with veiled threats about what might happen if House Stark dared cross House Lannister. Robb could almost taste the tension in the air as they prepared to ride south. The men at Riverrun, from the highest lords to the common soldiers, seemed to hold their breath. Many saw this as the pivotal moment that would decide the shape of the war to come. If the exchange went smoothly, Sansa would be free. The realm might be on a path to peace. If it went awry, it could lead to unimaginable bloodshed. Robb selected 100 of his best men. Stalwart knights, skilled archers, each loyal to the bone. He would lead them in person. Catelyn insisted on riding with him, refusing to be left behind at Riverrun. She could not endure waiting passively for news of her daughter's fate. Brynden Tully would command Riverrun in their absence, with reinforcements ready to ride if needed. They began the journey south, with Joffrey once again bound, this time carried in a reinforced cart, flanked by men with drawn swords at all hours. He seethed and whined, threatened and pleaded, but none listened. Gray wind padded alongside the party, uneasy in the warmer southern air. The farmland near King's Landing had once been lush, but war had stripped it bare in places. Burned fields, blackened farmsteads, and deserted hamlets greeted them as they approached the city. They were reminded that the War of the Five Kings had left no corner of the realm untouched. At dawn on the appointed day, they arrived at the designated spot. A wide expanse of farmland, a few withered trees, a small stone building that might once have been a stable. In the distance, King's Landing's walls rose, the Red Keep perched on its hill like a crouching beast. Robb's men dismounted and spread out, watchful. The air smelled of dust and tension. An early morning fog clung to the ground, swirling around their ankles. They waited. Catelyn clutched the reins of her horse, scanning the horizon, praying to the mother for Sansa's safety. Robb stood beside her, fully armored, sword at his hip, expression grim. Then they saw movement near the city road. Another party approached, also about 100 strong, clad in Lannister crimson. At their head rode a queen in fine raiment, Cersei Lannister, her golden hair gleaming, her eyes narrowed. Beside her were several Kingsguard knights. Behind them, A slight figure with auburn hair rode side saddle on a meek palfrey. The moment Catelyn spotted that red hair, her heart clenched. Sansa. The two parties halted some distance apart. A hush fell. Each side eyed the other warily. Cersei rode forward a few paces, a gauntlet of men on either side. Robb mirrored her. Grey Wind let out a low growl, but Robb calmed the direwolf with a motion of his hand. On the Lannister side, a pair of gold cloaks held crossbows at the ready. Sansa looked pale, thinner than before, bruises visible on her arms. Yet she sat upright, eyes darting anxiously. Catelyn's throat tightened at the sight of her daughter. Cersei's voice rang out, brittle with forced composure. "Show me my son." Robb signaled. The guards wheeled forward the cart in which Joffrey sat, hands bound, face twisted in indignation. He was gagged now to prevent his endless shouting. His eyes widened at the sight of his mother. Muffled sounds emerged from behind the gag. Cersei's lips pressed into a line. "Release him to me at once." Robb's voice was steady, though it carried an undercurrent of controlled wrath. "I will release him only when Sansa Stark is with us. If any harm befalls her, Joffrey will die." Cersei turned. Her men took hold of Sansa, guiding her forward. The girl was trembling. Catelyn broke from Robb's side, unable to bear it, and ran to Sansa's side, ignoring the hush of disapproval from the watchers. She clutched her daughter, tears brimming. "My sweet girl, you're safe now." Sansa clung to her mother, weeping softly. Cersei's scowl deepened, but she said nothing. Robb frowned, motioning for them to get behind his protective line. Once Sansa was securely among the Stark men, he turned back to Cersei. "Now," he said, "I will release your son." The Queen Regent's eyes were fixed on Joffrey, who was struggling against the ropes. "I want to see you untie him and let him walk to me." Robb nodded to the guards. They removed Joffrey's gag, cut his bonds, and helped him down from the cart. The boy staggered for a moment, then glared venomously at them. Cersei beckoned him. "Come here, my darling." Joffrey stumbled toward his mother, half running, half limping. He nearly collapsed into her arms, wailing about the indignities he had suffered. Cersei's face betrayed relief, but also fury. She glowered at Robb, voice dripping venom. "You will pay for this. All of you." Robb did not flinch. He motioned for his men to back away slowly, Sansa in their protective midst. "We have what we came for," he said. "Your threats mean nothing to me, so long as my sister is safe." At those words, Joffrey found his courage again. He wrenched away from Cersei's embrace and snarled at Robb, voice cracking. "You vile traitor! I'll have your head on a spike. I'll—" A sharp look from Cersei silenced him, but the hatred in his eyes was plain. Some of the Lannister knights stirred, as if itching for a fight. Tension crackled in the humid air. Robb braced for the possibility of treachery, but none came. They had matched the lawn. Nysters numbers. Any sudden attack would cost both sides dearly. Cersei was not fool enough to risk losing Joffrey again, and certainly not so soon after regaining him. Her eyes flicked to Sansa, lingering there for a moment, perhaps considering some last-second gambit. But she must have known that any attempt would bring retribution on Joffrey. So she merely hissed, "Leave us, dog," at Robb and turned away, spurring her horse to ride back to the city, her men forming a defensive ring around her and Joffrey. Robb's men exhaled. Relief mingled with the knowledge that a more dangerous phase of the war was likely to come. They had succeeded in recovering Sansa. They had lost Joffrey, but that was the agreed exchange. The real question was whether the Lannisters would now be more inclined to treat for peace, or if they would redouble their efforts to crush House Stark, outraged by the Boy King's humiliation. For the moment, though, Catelyn sank to her knees in the dusty road, holding Sansa tight, tears streaming. Robb stood over them, hand on Sansa's shoulder, a flicker of a comforting smile on his lips. "It's all right," he said softly. "You're safe now." Sansa trembled, murmuring apologies for all the mistakes she thought she had made, but Catelyn hushed her, stroking her hair. They made their retreat in cautious formation, fully expecting an ambush that never came. The farmland around them remained deserted, aside from the crows circling overhead. Once they were certain there was no pursuit, they quickened their pace, heading back toward the Riverlands. Sansa seemed dazed, traumatized by her experiences in King's Landing. She spoke little, only answering direct questions, and often flinched at sudden noises. It made Robb's anger at the Lannisters burn hotter, seeing what they had done to his sister. At least she was free. That night, they camped in a wooded glen. Catelyn fussed over Sansa, making sure she had hot food and a soft bedroll. Robb noticed that Sansa's wrists bore red marks, likely from manacles or rough handling, and that her eyes were haunted. It pained him, but he also felt a measure of grim satisfaction that they had achieved this victory. In the morning, they would press on, eventually returning to Riverrun, where Edmure and the others awaited them. When they arrived at Riverrun some days later, exhausted but triumphant, Sansa was greeted by cheers from the men who lined the walls and courtyard. They had all wanted to see one of the Stark girls safe. Only Arya was still missing, and they held on to hope that she might be found. Sansa's return gave them something to celebrate, a spark of joy in the gloom of war. She was ushered inside, where she could rest and recover, draped in clean clothes, comforted by family. Yet the war was not finished. Soon enough, more ravens arrived, letters from the west, from the crown, from other lords who watched the shifting tides with interest. Tywin Lannister, upon learning that Joffrey had been captive and then traded, flew into a towering rage at the slight done to his house. He dismissed any notion of the North's independence and declared that House Stark had still to answer for the kidnapping of the king. Hostilities would continue, he vowed, until the North was subdued. Robb read those words in the great hall at Riverrun. His bannermen assembled. Anger coursed through him. They had parted with their greatest bargaining chip to save Sansa, and still the Lannisters would not cease their aggression. He slammed a fist onto the table. "They will never yield," he said. "We captured their king, humiliated him, and they want blood. They refuse even to consider the North's independence." The men looked grim. The Great John grumbled that they should march south and burn the Westerlands to the ground. Karstark murmured agreement, thirsting for vengeance for the loss of his sons. But the Blackfish counseled caution. "We have gained your sister, which is no small thing," he reminded Robb. "Yet we lost our hostage. We cannot pretend that Tywin will lie down simply because Joffrey's pride was wounded. The question is, how do we achieve our aims now?" Robb thought hard, remembering each piece of the puzzle. He had alliances to consider, potential allegiances with Stannis or Renly. The phrase, fickle but powerful, might be persuaded to aid him further if the match with one of their daughters was honored. The Vale, under Lisa Arryn's uncertain leadership, remained neutral. And what of the Iron Islands with Balon Greyjoy's ambitions? The realm was a tinderbox. Any spark might set off a new blaze. Capturing Joffrey had been a bold stroke, but the Lannisters' pride was legendary. They would not negotiate beyond what they had already done to recover him. Now, the war loomed once more, uglier and more personal than ever. "It seems we must fight on," Robb said quietly, "but we do so knowing Sansa is safe behind our walls. Arya remains missing, yet at least one sister is free. We will plan our next moves carefully. Tywin wants to break us. We cannot let him." He looked to Sansa, who stood beside her mother, pale and determined. "We fight for those we love, for our home, and for the North. That is all the reason we need." The men murmured assent. The die had been cast. Robb's gambit had saved Sansa, yet the war ground on. Cersei's hatred, Joffrey's humiliation, Tywin's wrath, all conspired to make peace impossible. The Riverlands would remain a battleground, and the North braced itself for further storms. But at least one Stark child was free of Lannister chains. Perhaps that small victory would embolden them in the trials to come. Riverrun's walls seemed both welcoming and confining as the days turned to weeks again. Robb spent his time meeting with envoys, planning campaigns, and comforting Sansa, who slowly regained some measure of her old kindness. though her innocence had been irreparably scarred. Some nights, Robb would walk the battlements with gray wind, gazing at the river's dark surface, remembering the day he captured Joffrey. Part of him wished he had simply executed the boy king then and there, ended one source of evil. But then he recalled Sansa's trembling form and knew he had done what was necessary. A single life, even Joffrey's, was worth sacrificing to save his sister. Letters reached them from the north. Roose Bolton had returned to the Dreadfort, the Manderleys were still provisioning White Harbor, and word came that Winterfell was safe for the time being. But there were tales of Ironborn ships harassing the coastline. Balon Greyjoy, it seemed, would not let this war pass him by. Robb felt the weight on his shoulders intensify. How many enemies must he face? He thought of his father often, wondering what counsel Ned Stark would have given. Perhaps to persevere with honor, to treat allies and foes alike with fairness. Yet war was a cruel teacher, and Robb had learned that cunning and ruthlessness often won the day. Still, he tried to be just. He refused to let bitterness corrode him, though sometimes, in the stillness of night, the desire for vengeance gnawed at his heart. In those hours, he would sometimes sit in the godswood, listening to the rustle of leaves, wishing for the old gods to grant him wisdom. Sansa came to sit with him there once, timidly. She apologized over and over for the naive words she had once said in King's Landing, for not understanding the Lannisters' cruelty. Robb held her hand gently. "You were a child," he said. "We all were, in some ways. This war has made us older than our years." She gazed at him, eyes brimming with tears. "Will we ever see Winterfell again?" He gave her a small, sad smile. "We will," he promised, though in his heart he was not sure. The war was unpredictable, but he had to speak hope. For her sake, for his own, for the memory of their father. Their mother joined them then, wrapping her arms around both her children. "The gods are good," she said softly, though her own eyes shone with unshed tears. "They reunited us with Sansa. We must have faith they will bring us Arya too." Robb and Sansa leaned against her, the last vestiges of their innocence clinging to that familial warmth, drawing strength from the bond of blood. For a moment, all the burdens of war seemed to recede, and they were just mother and children, sharing a tender moment beneath the heart tree's red leaves. Beyond the castle walls, the world still raged. Joffrey, restored to his seat in King's Landing, was said to be more vicious than ever, humiliating those who had failed him, calling down curses on House Stark. Tywin was mobilizing fresh levies from the Westerlands, stoking old grudges against the Tullus and the North. The Crown, ever short on coin, raised taxes across the realm. Traders complained that the roads grew unsafe. Famine threatened in some areas where the fields had been burned. Meanwhile, the other self-proclaimed kings, Stannis, Renly, Balon, even the boy calling himself Aegon Targaryen in whispers, moved their pieces on the board, each with designs on the Iron Throne. Chaos reigned. Yet within Riverrun, the presence of Sansa felt like a glimmer of triumph that no one could take from the Starks. Robb received frequent missives from the Northern Lords, urging him to remain steadfast, to hold the banner of the king in the North high. He answered them in measured tones, forging alliances where he could, refusing to commit his forces rashly. He knew that the day would come when the next great battle was joined. But until that time, he wanted to consolidate, to preserve the lives of his men, to strengthen his position. The capture of Joffrey had proven one thing: cunning and surprise could yield enormous gains. There might be another chance to strike a decisive blow when least expected. And so the realm continued to revolve around the uncertain axis of war. What if Robb had never captured Joffrey that fateful day at Riverrun? Sansa would still languish in King's Landing, and the North might have bent under the Crown's relentless pressure. But that single audacious act had changed the shape of the conflict, giving House Stark the upper hand briefly, and rescuing at least one of Ned Stark's daughters from Lannister tyranny. Now, with Joffrey back on the Iron Throne, the lines were drawn once more. The difference was that the boy king had tasted mortal fear. The scars on his pride would not soon heal, and his wrath would color every Lannister policy. For Robb, each day dawned with new challenges, new councils, new letters from the corners of the Seven Kingdoms. But amid it all, he found comfort in knowing that at least Sansa slept behind safe walls, guarded by men who loved her, free from the Red Keep's cruelty. He had struck a blow for Stark supremacy, if only for a moment. And if the Lannisters believed that the wolves of the North had tired or lost their nerve, they would soon learn otherwise. For winter was coming, and House Stark was ready to bear its fangs if the war demanded it. That single stroke, capturing Joffrey at Riverrun, had set them on a course that no one in the Seven Kingdoms could have foreseen. Perhaps, in the end, it would be enough to ensure the North remained unbowed. As the chill winds of autumn swept across the Riverlands, Robb would stand on Riverrun's walls at dusk, watching the direwolf banners stir, remembering that moment he had pressed the point of his sword against Joffrey's back, hearing the boys' sniveling pleas. He would recall how close he had come to plunging the steel into the child's spine, avenging his father in an instant of bloody justice. But he had chosen the path of strategy over blind vengeance. And for that, Sansa was here, alive, her mother was not lost to sorrow, and the North's cause still endured. Whatever fresh terrors the war might bring, Robb Stark was at least certain he had done what a king must do: put his family and people before his own thirst for revenge. If the old gods were kind, that resolve would be rewarded in time. He allowed himself a small smile, remembering the trembling face of the boy king who had once boasted of lords and crowns, only to be brought low by the same cruelty he had inflicted on others. Joffrey might rule from the Iron Throne again, but in his heart, he would remember the day the Wolf King held him captive, and for one shattering moment, had all the power in the world, and chose to spare his life. If that memory haunted Joffrey's nights, so much the better. Let him fear the North. Let him remember that there was a price to be paid for executing Ned Stark, for threatening the Stark children, and for bringing war to the realm. Robb took a steadying breath, eyes scanning the horizon, where the red sun sank into the fields. Tomorrow, new decisions would have to be made, about alliances, about the looming threat of Tywin Lannister's massed forces, about the rumored moves of Stannis and Renly. But for this moment, a fragile peace glimmered in the twilight. He closed his eyes, whispering a prayer to the old gods for Arya's safety. Then he turned, stepping down from the wall to join his mother and sister at supper, carrying on as the king in the North, forging a path toward a future in which the North would stand free, and House Stark would endure. That was how the night passed at Riverrun, the waters flowing quietly under the moon, the men sleeping with swords at the ready, and the wolves dreaming of winter's approach. And somewhere far away, Joffrey seethed within the Red Keep, swearing vengeance on all the wolves of the North. While the realm slid deeper into chaos, the Game of Thrones played at a higher stake than ever before. Yet in the stronghold by the river, for one more day, the Starks held tight to each other, bolstered by the victory that had begun when a young king rode out to capture a boy who fancied himself the ruler of the Seven Kingdoms, and ended with the forging of a new hope for House Stark. Swords would clash again, and blood would be spilled, but for now, the North had gained a measure of strength that no crown could easily snuff out. And in the halls where Ned Stark's memory still lingered, that was all the reason they needed to keep fighting, no matter what the morrow might bring. Robb Stark rose before dawn on the day following Sansa's return to Riverrun, restless from a night of uneasy dreams in which memories of Joffrey's capture warred with the raw image of his father's death. He stepped from his chamber into the corridor, still tugging on the sleeves of his doublet. The stone floors were cold underfoot, and a watery light seeped in through the narrow windows, revealing the hollow shadows beneath his eyes. At his side padded gray wind, silent as a stalking shadow. Downstairs, in the lower levels near the kitchen yard, Robb could already hear the clatter of pots and the low murmur of the waking guards. He paused on a small balcony overlooking Riverrun's main courtyard. The dawn was a hazy pink, the river mists clinging to the battlements. Banners fluttered in the breeze. Tully Trout, Stark Direwolf, and soldiers on the walls exchanged yawns for salutes as their shifts changed. Robb let his gaze sweep across the stones below, absorbing the fresh calm that often settled just before the day's demands sprang upon him. He could imagine his father standing thus in Winterfell at first light, watchful, thinking of duty. That memory, half hurting and half heartening, steeled him. He descended to the great hall, the air tinged with the familiar aroma of wood smoke and bread. A guard at the doors bowed stiffly. "Good morning, Your Grace," he said. Robb nodded in acknowledgement. Inside, the hall was quiet. A few servants straightened benches, swept up rushes from last night's gatherings. 2 nights prior, they had shared a subdued feast to mark Sansa's safe return, though the tension beneath the surface had been palpable. Now, the only occupant was his mother, Lady Catelyn, seated near the central hearth. She looked up as he approached, and he saw fresh lines of worry etched around her eyes, though her face softened when she managed to smile for him. "Robb," she said gently, rising to greet him. He bent to kiss her cheek. She guided him to the table, where a pot of spiced wine and a wooden bowl of small clothes in need of mending sat side by side, as though the domestic and the political had become hopelessly entangled. "How is Sansa?" Robb asked, settling onto the bench. Gray Wind curled himself at Robb's feet, muzzle resting on enormous paws. Catelyn sighed, folding a shirt along her lap. "She slept better last night, I think, but I can see the pain in her eyes. She worries she disappointed us. I've tried to reassure her that none of this war is her doing. The Lannisters manipulated her." Robb stared into the hearth flames. "We'll have to give her time. The Red Keep is not a gentle place, and Cersei is a cruel keeper." Catelyn set aside the shirt and ran a hand over her face. "I worry about what they might have done to her, but I am grateful she's here, safe. Your father would be relieved." Her voice trembled on those last words. Robb took her hand. "We've recovered one sister, at least. The next question is how we find Arya. Without Joffrey in our hands, we have less of a bargaining chip." That was the crux of it. For a time, the king in the north had held the greatest prize in the realm. Now Joffrey Baratheon was back in his mother's arms in King's Landing, no doubt vowing hideous revenge. Had Robb been more ruthless, he might have refused to trade Joffrey for Sansa at all, and yet that would have damned his sister to further torment or worse. In the end, he could not regret his choice. Catelyn drew a shallow breath. "I've petitioned every contact I still have in the city. Some whisper that Arya escaped the day your father, the day he died. Others claim the gold cloaks recaptured her but kept it secret. I can't find a single trusted witness to confirm either story. If the child is alive and wandering somewhere, the gods be good, she might find help." Robb felt a stirring of hope. Arya was strong-willed, resourceful in ways that sometimes outstripped Sansa. He tried to imagine his little sister forging her own path through the warrens of King's Landing or beyond. If anyone could slip free of the Lannisters, it might be Arya. Even so, the uncertainty gnawed at him. He was about to respond when the rhythmic clang of the portcullis echoed through the hall, and shortly after, a breathless guard appeared at the threshold. "Beg pardon, Your Grace, my lady," he panted. "But Lord Rickard Karstark and the Great John have arrived from their scouting along the Red Fork. They request an immediate audience." Robb nodded and rose, urging his mother to come with him. Gray Wind loped at their side as they crossed the courtyard, where stable hands were helping Karstark and the Great John dismount. The men looked road-weary, mud streaking their boots and cloaks. Karstark's features were grim. The Great John's wide mouth was set in an uncharacteristically tense line. Catelyn greeted them politely, but both men spoke at once. The Great John's booming voice overtook Karstark's quieter tone. "We've got news from the west. Tywin Lannister is massing a new host near the Gold Road. Word is he's summoning his bannermen from the Westerlands, every minor lord who can still field troops. Likely they mean to strike at Harrenhal or further east." Karstark nodded, flicking a glance at Robb. "We spied outrider encampments, small pockets of men gathering. It's not a rumor, Your Grace. Tywin is planning a major assault. Perhaps on the Trident, perhaps deeper. It's too large an army to be mere show." Robb felt the tension coil in his gut. He had expected Tywin's retribution eventua. LLY. The Lannisters would not leave the humiliation of Joffrey's capture unanswered. "How many men?" Karstark exhaled, rubbing at the dust on his beard. Word from local peasants suggests close to 10,000 knights and men-at-arms, with more coming in daily. They've got blacksmiths, supply wagons, the beginnings of a siege train. If we remain idle, they'll soon march upon the Riverlands in earnest. Caitlyn's face tightened. The Tully lands are still recovering from Tywin's earlier depredations. And if Harrenhal is regarrisoned, that fortress is a dagger at the heart of the Trident. Robb glanced between the two lords. We need more information. Do we know who commands these forces aside from Tywin? Is Ser Gregor among them? The mountain would be used to terrorize the local villages again. We can't say, Karstark admitted. The outriders we spoke to only glimpsed the lion banners. They recognized Tywin standards, but the rest are a guessing game. Crakehall, Marbrand, Lefford, perhaps. The usual loyal houses. Robb muttered a curse under his breath. The weight of command pressed upon him, urging swift decisions. But he was no fool. Charging west with a partial host to meet Tywin head-on could be disastrous. The Lannisters had deeper coffers, more hired swords, and a strong desire to avenge their king's humiliation. There had to be a plan, a cunning stroke that could hamper Tywin's momentum without forfeiting the safety of Sansa and Catelyn here in Riverrun. He turned to them all. We'll summon a war council. Send word for the Blackfish, Edmure, and Ser Helman Tallheart. We'll discuss how best to parry this threat. And I want to know if we have any news of Renly or Stannis. If either of the Baratheons moves on King's Landing, Tywin's forces might be split. The Great John scratched at his beard. Last we heard, Renly marched with a massive southern host but was forced to turn back after an ill-fated clash with Stannis near Storm's End. The details are murky, but it seems the brothers are content to glare at each other for the moment. They may be too busy squabbling to muster a direct attack on the capital. Robb's lips pressed tight. This war of 5 kings churned on in every corner of the realm, each faction self-absorbed. He sensed that the North's best chance of success lay in forging alliances. Yet who could he trust when each man coveted the Iron Throne for himself? The only solace was that Joffrey, for all his venom, had lost the moral high ground after his humiliating capture. Many lords in the realm regarded him as a petty tyrant. Still, Tywin's gold could buy plenty of swords. He dismissed Karstark and the Great John to find rest and refreshment, then clasped his mother's hand. Give me an hour to gather my thoughts. Then we'll meet in the Solar for council. She squeezed his fingers lightly, concern etched in her eyes. Remember, Robb, we must not allow Tywin to lure us into a trap. One rash charge, and we could lose everything. He nodded. I haven't forgotten my father's mistakes, nor do I intend to repeat them. She seemed to flinch at the mention of Ned's downfall, but she gave him a faint, proud smile and let him go. Robb went out to the yard, needing a moment to quiet his mind. He passed the stables, where Sansa had retreated into a corner with a sack of apples, feeding an old mare gently. She started when she saw him, blinking as if uncertain whether she should curtsy or speak. Robb came forward. She was thinner, yes, but the lines of her face seemed firmer, the childlike roundness replaced by something more somber. How are you today? He asked, his voice soft. She ducked her head. I'm fine, Robb. Just needed some air. I thought I might help the stable boys. It's silly, but I've missed the horses. He reached out and touched her shoulder lightly. I understand. You do whatever helps you find peace. The War Council meets soon, but you need not attend if you'd rather rest. I want you safe. Her eyes glinted with unshed tears. Thank you. I still feel as though any moment the Lannisters might snatch me back. I can't shake the fear. He wanted to assure her that such a thing would never happen, but he could not lie. The realm was full of betrayal and shifting loyalties. Instead, he said, You're under our protection now, Sansa. No one will harm you here. She nodded, brushing the mare's mane absently, and Robb stepped away, leaving her to that small piece of solace. Gray wind ambled along, sniffing at the stable doors. Within the hour, the War Council convened in Riverrun Solar. It was a modest room, the walls adorned with tapestries of House Tully's silver trout. The table had been cleared except for a map of the Trident. Robb stood at the head, his mother to his left, Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, at his right, with Edmure Tully, the Great John Rickard Karstark, and Ser Helman Tallheart arranged around them. The men wore expressions of grave intent, each fully aware that Tywin's next move could test the North as never before. Robb gestured to the map. Lord Karstark says Tywin's new host grows daily in the west. That means a possible push toward Harrenhal. If the Lannisters seize that fortress again in strength, they can strike at will into the heart of the Riverlands. Or they might march north, aiming to sever our supply lines from the neck. They may also threaten Riverrun itself. Edmure bristled. We Tullys have harried their outriders whenever we could, but my men are stretched thin garrisoning the outlying keeps. We need a strategy for the entire region, not just piecemeal skirmishes. The Great John thumped a fist on the table. We're tired of Tywin's nips and bites. Let's crush him now. Rally all our forces, join with Roose Bolton's men, and face the lions in open battle. We're the North, fearless and hungry for vengeance. A few lords murmured agreement, but Robb frowned, remembering how Tywin thrived on luring foes into disadvantage. Open battle might be what he wants. He has more men and more cavalry. A single pitched confrontation could cost us dearly. We need cunning, as we used at the Whispering Wood and the Battle of the Camps. Surprise and strategic positioning. Brynden Tully nodded thoughtfully. We could try to block Tywin's approach to Harrenhal. The fortress is not as formidable as in ages past, but it remains the largest in the river region. If we station men in the surrounding territory, we might deny him easy passage. Karstark rubbed his jaw. But if Tywin decides to circumvent Harrenhal altogether, he might push toward the crossroads, splitting our forces along the Green Fork. Then the river lords would be isolated. Ser Helman Tallheart, quiet until now, stepped forward. We should consider whether alliances with either Renly or Stannis can divert Tywin's attention. If one of the Baratheons threatens King's Landing, Tywin can't afford to ignore them. Robb leaned his weight on the table, scanning each face. Renly offered us nothing of substance before. Stannis is too proud to accept me as king in the North, and I have little reason to bend the knee to his cause. Still, we might send envoys to see if either is open to a bargain. We wouldn't commit men, only see if they can strike the Lannisters from another front. Catelyn's voice was soft but firm. And what of the Ironborn? Have we any new tidings of Balon Greyjoy? A hush fell. The memory of the Ironborn rebellion that had cost the North many lives still stung. Robb's father had helped crush Balon's uprising, and Theon Greyjoy had been a ward in Winterfell for years, forging a sort of bond with the Starks, or so they had believed. The last letters from the North had hinted at Ironborn ships reaving along the coasts, but no full-scale invasion was yet confirmed. No fresh word, Robb said, but we'd be fools to leave the North unguarded. Roose Bolton is there with a portion of our forces, and Lord Manderly stands ready at White Harbor. If Balon attempts to seize our shores, they'll respond, though it could spread us thin. The Great John let out a snort. Better we stay here in the Riverlands and fight the real war, not chase after Greyjoy illusions. The Ironborn rarely have the men or discipline for a proper invasion. Raids, yes, but they won't hold land. Brynden Tully tapped the map near the neck. Yet a single surprise could cost us dearly. I recall your father's warnings. Robb, Balon Greyjoy is cunning, even if he's half mad. Robb listened to every voice, absorbing the complexities of a realm at war on all sides. Finally, he straightened. We must deal with the immediate threat, Tywin's new host. If they reinforce Harrenhal, the Riverlands will suffer. I propose we move swiftly to garrison strategic points around Harrenhal, not inside it. We don't have the men to hold such a massive ruin, but controlling the approach roads. If Tywin wants it, he'll have to fight uphill. Meanwhile, we keep a mobile force in reserve to strike if he divides his army. There was some nodding around the table, though not all looked fully satisfied. Catelyn's brow furrowed. And if Tywin marches in full force, are we prepared to retreat and draw him out? Robb pressed his lips together. We may have to, Better to bleed him in smaller engagements than meet him in a single open field where his numbers prevail. We'll continue to hamper his supply lines. The river lords know this land can strike and vanish. We've done it before, though we'll have to be even more vigilant. They spent another hour hashing out specifics, dispatching certain lords to guard the fords, ensuring outriders patrolled every road. Robb dictated letters to be sent north, reaffirming that the bulk of the Stark forces must remain prepared for potential Ironborn mischief. By the end, a workable plan had emerged, though far from an ideal one. War was never neat. When the meeting concluded, most departed to carry out tasks or snatch a brief rest before departing for their new posts. Caitlin lingered with Robb, her face taut. "I'll arrange the letters to Renly and Stannis," she said, "though I don't trust either to truly aid us." Robb nodded. "Every small advantage might help. And we need to keep the Vale in mind, your sister, Lisa. Though I doubt we can rely on her, given how she clings to her own isolation." A flicker of sadness crossed Caitlin's face. Lisa's changed since her husband's death. She may not even respond. "But I'll send a raven." Robb stepped to the Solar's window, gazing out at Riverrun's courtyard. The sun had climbed fully now, gilding the banners and the restless swirl of men below. He thought of Sansa feeding the mare, of the Grachan's thirst for battle, of Arya lost somewhere in the wide realm. He thought of Joffrey back in King's Landing, perhaps still reeling from the humiliation of captivity, hunger for vengeance fueling every breath. The war had only just begun, and it would be fierce. But the North had proven it could fight and surprise even the greatest generals. He hoped that cunning would see them through what was yet to come. That evening, a hush fell over the fortress, as though even Riverrun's stones knew they stood on the brink of a new storm. Sansa joined her mother and Robb for a modest supper in a smaller dining chamber. The servants brought bread, fish stew, and some cheese, while outside the windows, the red glow of twilight deepened into night. They spoke quietly, mostly of small things. Tales of Winterfell's old hunts, memories of simpler times. Caitlin tried to coax Sansa to eat more, but the girl's appetite seemed fragile. "How do you feel about traveling to the Twins, if it comes to that?" Robb asked Sansa at one point. "We might need Walder Frey's men again, though the old man is difficult." Sansa lowered her gaze. "If you command it, Robb, I'll go. But do you think Lord Frey will be kind?" Caitlin snorted softly. "Lord Frey is rarely kind, but he values advantage. He's sworn to House Tully. Keep your courtesy, Sansa. That's half the battle with that family." Sansa only nodded, eyes drifting to the flames. Then she asked in a quiet voice, "Will there be more battles soon?" Robb could not lie. "Likely, yes. Tywin must respond to what happened. We might keep him at bay for a time, but there will be fighting." She trembled slightly, her spoon clattering. "I hate it," she whispered. "I hate all of it. Why does war have to happen because of people like Joffrey?" Caitlin reached across to squeeze her hand. Robb felt his own heart twist at the longing in Sansa's eyes, the yearning for a world in which courtesy and chivalry triumphed. But that was not the realm they lived in. "We do it for each other," Robb said at last, voice low. "For our family, for the North. We fight so that we can find a day when we no longer need to fight." Sansa's eyes glistened with tears, but she gave a small, solemn nod. When supper ended, Caitlin accompanied Sansa to her chamber, leaving Robb to pace the corridors alone. Gray wind followed, silent as always, just the rhythmic click of claws on stone. Robb passed the great hall, the tapestry-lined corridors, the torchlit arches, feeling the hush of the castle. For a moment, he recalled the distant hush of Winterfell on a cold night, the thick walls and the old godswood. He ached for home, but war demanded he remain in the Riverlands, forging alliances, meeting the Lannisters' threat. He made his way to the courtyard and climbed a stair to the battlements. Guards nodded as he passed, letting him stand near a crenel to peer over the dark waters. The river glinted in starlight. It was a calm scene, but he knew that out there, beyond the meandering banks, Tywin Lannister's men readied for the next campaign. The realm had never seemed so large and so perilous. In the morning, men began to depart, carrying out Robb's orders to reinforce roads and fords near Harrenhal and beyond. Riders trotted across the drawbridge, banners snapping. The sky was overcast, promising rain. Robb stood in the gatehouse, overseeing final instructions, a clenched readiness in every line of his posture. The Great John rode out at the head of 200 fierce Northmen, headed toward the upper Green Fork to guard against Tywin slipping across. Karstark left with his own contingent, planning to link with the Blackwood and Bracken forces along the southern approach to Harrenhal. Ser Helman Tallheart was dispatched further east, to watch the routes leading toward the Crownlands. By midday, Riverrun's yard was emptier. Only Edmure Tully's men and a modest force of Northmen remained to hold the castle. Catelyn was in the Solar, penning letters to the Vale, Storm's End, and Dragonstone, though none had illusions that Lysa, Renly, or Stannis would leap to the Stark's aid. Robb found Sansa in the Godswood, a small copse of ancient oaks and willows fed by a winding stream that coursed along the castle perimeter. Though not as grand as Winterfell's, it offered a sense of quiet. She was kneeling by the water, her hair unbound, just listening to the trickle as she stared at the reflection of clouds drifting overhead. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. Gray wind rustled through the undergrowth, sniffing. Sansa looked up. For a moment, he thought she resembled Arya in her unguarded expression. Grief and longing mixed with a fierce spark. "You once told me," she said, "that the trees in Winterfell's gods would seem alive, that Father prayed there. I barely ever went. I always thought the Sept was more beautiful. But now, I miss it all." Robb hesitated before sitting beside her on the damp earth, setting aside the weight of command for a few precious moments. He let the calm of the gods would ease the tension in his spine. "I remember the heart tree at Winterfell," he murmured, its face carved in the bark, the red leaves drifting on the pool. "Father would kneel there for hours sometimes." Sansa traced a finger across the surface of the stream, making small ripples. "I didn't understand why he did that. I thought it was dull, or that he was sad." Robb lowered his voice. Perhaps he was sad sometimes, but he found solace in that place. He drew strength from the old gods and from quiet reflection. She turned her face to his. "Do you pray for Arya?" He felt the swell of emotion in his chest. "Yes," he said, "though I don't know if the gods listen. But I pray she's alive, that she'll find her way back to us." Sansa nodded, returning her gaze to the water. "I pray for that too." They stayed like that for a while, silent siblings in a realm turned upside down, each longing for the days when they had been children at Winterfell, the biggest worries being lessons or who would get the largest slice of honey cake at supper. Now they were caught in the savage wheels of politics and war, their father gone. But they were still Starks, and that meant something. Several days later, ravens brought fresh tidings. One arrived from Lord Roose Bolton in the north, bearing ambiguous news. Balon Greyjoy was indeed stirring along the coasts, his longships harrying smaller ports, but so far no major invasion had come. Robb passed the letter to his mother. They read it with set faces. Bolton promised vigilance, but suggested Robb not weaken his presence in the Riverlands unless absolutely necessary. A second letter arrived from King's Landing, no official seal, but the script was something akin to what Robb recalled of Varys' style, half compliments and half cunning. It spoke of small hints that the crown was facing internal strife. Joffrey's tantrums had grown more frequent, prompting friction among the royal court. Rumors circulated that the crown's gold was dwindling faster than expected. If there was any attempt at official negotiation, no one had advanced it. Robb paced after reading this. "They're fracturing from within. That might be to our advantage, but it doesn't solve Tywin's muster in the west." Edmure Tully, who had been helping read reports, said, "If King's Landing is weak, Tywin might be forced to return there eventually. But for now, he has the gold of Casterly Rock fueling his war chest." Catelyn rubbed her temples. "There's also a short letter from Lysa, if you can call it that. She regrets the realm's troubles but says the Vale cannot risk its own safety. That is all." A sardonic laugh escaped Robb. No surprise. Aunt Lisa is determined to keep her gates closed. We'll get no help from that quarter. He considered sending an envoy to either Stannis or Renly, if only to gauge their willingness to pressure the Lannisters from another angle. But each day's delay gave Tywin more time to gather men. The North's best hope was to hamper Tywin's ability to strike effectively, force him into a quagmire in the Riverlands, and hope that the other claimants to the throne eventually made their moves. And so the next fortnight passed in a haze of preparation. Scouts rode out daily, returning with word of Lannister outrider sightings near the fringes of Harrenhal's domain. Rain slicked the roads, turning fields to mud. Occasional skirmishes flared as Tully men ambushed small Lannister parties, or the mountains men torched outlying hamlets. Each day, Robb planned, adjusting his small pieces on the board, trying to anticipate Tywin's next stroke. Late one afternoon, a messenger arrived in a lather, barely able to stand after riding through the night. He reported that Tywin had split his forces, half encamped near the ruins of Harrenhal, half moving northeast. The exact target was unclear, but it might be the crossroads in or even a push toward Riverrun. The messenger's news incited immediate calls to arms in Riverrun. Robb mustered the men still under his command, fewer than he'd like, but enough for a cunning strike if the moment presented itself. He had Edmure hold the fortress while he led a mobile force out to intercept. They left at dawn in a cold drizzle, lances rattling, hooves clopping over slick roads. Catelyn stayed behind with Sansa, though neither mother nor daughter was pleased to see him go. Catelyn tried to mask her worry under a stoic farewell, while Sansa clung to his hand, pleading softly that he stay safe. "We fight to keep you safe," he told her. "I promise I'll return." With that, he and his men rode off under the direwolf banner, gray wind bounding ahead. The roads were sodden, mud sucking at the horses' hooves, but the men pressed on, grim and determined. They were joined by small bands of Tully outriders, local guides, and a handful of knights from the Vale who had chosen to stay with Catelyn out of loyalty to her father's memory rather than follow Lisa's retreat. It was not a large host, but it was cohesive, and they carried a sharp sense of purpose. Rain hounded them for the better part of 3 days. They marched through farmland riddled with shallow puddles, past villages half deserted by fearful peasants. Occasionally, they found burned huts or the stench of newly dug graves. The men muttered curses at the Lannisters, remembering their savage raids. Every so often, an outrider reported glimpses of Lannister scouts to the west, but no direct contact. Robb kept the host moving in disciplined formation, mindful of ambush. He recalled well how he had once surprised Jaime Lannister at the Whispering Wood. Tywin was no less cunning. At last, near the crossroads, they heard from local peasants that a Lannister force was camped 2 leagues away, possibly planning to push further east at first light. Robb conferred with his captains in the pouring rain, huddled under the sagging roof of an abandoned stable. A flickering lantern lit the map. "We can't match them man for man," one captain warned. "They have at least 1,000, likely more." "We have half that," said another, "though we might have the advantage of surprise if we move tonight." Robb studied the rough lines. "We can harass them, burn their supply wagons, vanish before their main body forms ranks. If the weather holds, we can use the mud in our favor. Cavalry is less maneuverable in these conditions, but our men are prepared." And so they devised a nighttime raid. Once the dark had deepened and the patter of rain cloaked their movements, Robb led a select group of horse and foot, creeping close to the Lannister encampment. Lantern light bobbed among the tents, revealing guards half-shivering and cursing the downpour. The hush of the storm shielded the approach of Grey Wind and 2 other northern direwolves, offspring of the same litter, though smaller and less famous than Robb's companion, who rushed the outer sentries, sowing panic. Within moments, northern archers loosed arrows into the tents. Shouts erupted as Lannister men scrambled, slipping in the mud. Robb's cavalry swept in from the flank, torches thrust forward to ignite the wagons loaded with supplies. The smell of burning canvas mingled with the rank odor of damp straw. Screams rose in the gloom, the clang of steel on steel. Robb brandished his sword, urging caution to his men. He wanted a swift, punishing strike, not a prolonged melee that would risk heavy losses. Lightning flashed overhead, revealing the chaos. Lannister soldiers flailing in half-fastened armor, some stumbling over tent ropes. Gray wind sprang at a man who tried to rally a handful of crossbowmen. A flash of teeth, a shriek, then darkness. Thunder rolled. In the flickering torchlight, Robb saw the supply wagons ablaze, flames leaping into the night. A stable, half-collapsed, spat sparks into the muddy yard. His men pressed the advantage for only a short time before Robb signaled the withdrawal horn. They had inflicted a sharp wound, but staying longer would give the Lannisters time to mass and counterattack. Reluctantly, the raiders pulled back, sowing confusion as they vanished into the night. Hoofbeats thundered through puddles, and behind them the Lannister camp glowed with scattered fires, their outraged shouts echoing across the plain. They regrouped at a prearranged clearing. Robb counted heads, relief warring with sorrow that a few of his men had fallen. The tall grasses were soaked, horses frothed at the mouth from the gallop. Some men had gashes or arrow scrapes, but the main body was intact, and they had destroyed Lannister supplies critical to Tywin's campaign. Even 1,000 men could not march far without adequate provisions. As dawn broke, the rain eased, leaving the fields wreathed in pale mist. Robb's men caught fleeting glimpses of Lannister outriders searching for them, but the outriders dared not venture too far alone for fear of another ambush. By midday, the Northmen had put enough distance between themselves and the Lannister main camp to find a defensible position near a wooded ridge. There they paused, setting pickets and seeing to wounded. Robb himself walked among the survivors, offering praise and thanks, assisting where he could with bandages. He was the king in the north, yet he refused to stand apart from his men's suffering. They had gambled their lives on his plan, and they had succeeded. The taste of that success was bittersweet. They had struck a blow, but the war was still in its early throes. A scout arrived, panting, with word that the Lannisters were trying to rally near the crossroads. Their commander, some believed it was Ser Harry's Swift, was enraged at the loss of the wagons. Another rumor suggested the mountain himself might be somewhere near Harrenhal. Robb's mouth tightened at that. Gregor Clegane was a beast in human form, known for his brutality. If Tywin unleashed him on the local population, the Riverlands would suffer anew. That evening, Robb held a brief council by the dim glow of a covered lantern. His captains included Lord Jason Mallister, who had arrived unexpectedly with a small band of archers. They discussed whether to attempt another raid or return to Riverrun. Ultimately, they decided to keep pressuring the Lannisters if possible. Any day they forced Tywin's men to go hungry was a day the Riverlands breathed easier, so they waged a campaign of quick strikes, seldom engaging in pitched battle. When Lannister outriders ventured too far, the Northmen ambushed them. When a newly arrived baggage train emerged on the road, archers and cavalry swooped in at dusk or dawn, employing the cover of poor weather, local knowledge, and the fearsome presence of direwolves to scatter the enemy. Bit by bit, Tywin's plan to swiftly take control of the region was frustrated. Still, the cost was not small. The Lannisters fought back. Now and then, small columns of northern men were isolated and overrun, or a knight from the Westerlands led a punishing charge that forced a retreat. The fields and fords of the Trident became battle-scarred, dotted with the smoking remains of wagons, the churned mud of cavalry lines, and the broken bodies of men. All the while, Robb felt the strain. He sent messages back to Riverrun when he could, letting his mother and Sansa know he was well, that they were holding the Lannisters at bay. In return, Catelyn's ravens brought news that Edmure maintained a strong defense and that Sansa was assisting in caring for refugees who trickled in from burned villages. She had apparently found a form of courage in comforting children and mothers who had fled the fighting. That gladdened Robb. Sansa was discovering depths of empathy and resilience that her life in King's Landing had stifled. But not all news was good. One letter described a vicious raid by Ser Gregor's band near a hamlet close to Harrenhal, with atrocities that made Robb's blood run cold. Another told of a rumored approach by Tywin himself, who might be gathering the rest of his forces for a more decisive push. Robb recognized that though these raids slowed Tywin, they would not stop him forever. And winter, though not yet arrived, loomed on the horizon. The nights grew chill. A sense of urgency built. At last, after nearly a month of skirmishing, Robb judged it wise to return briefly to Riverrun and reassess. The men needed rest and resupply, and he wanted to be sure Tywin could not slip around and besiege the castle behind his back. They pulled back by forced marches, a battered but still formidable host. Along the way, they saw the scars of war in the shape of burned farmhouses, abandoned fields, crows picking at carrion. When Riverrun's towers came into view, Robb felt a surge of relief. He and his men crossed the drawbridge, greeted by the watchful faces of archers on the walls. Inside the courtyard, stable boys rushed to take the horses. Catelyn was waiting, composure carefully held, though her eyes shone with tears of relief at seeing her son ride in. Sansa stood nearby with a stoic expression, shoulders tense, hands clasped. As soon as Robb dismounted, gray wind bounding around him, Sansa hurried forward. "Brother!" she exclaimed, a tremor in her voice. Do you need?" "I'm all right," he assured her, giving her a quick embrace. "Just tired." She swallowed, taking in the sight of muddied boots, the lines of exhaustion on his face, the dented edges of his breastplate. Her expression flickered with sympathy and horror. "I've been tending the wounded here. So many stories. So much pain." Robb nodded. "War spares no one, but we've slowed Tywin. That's something." Catelyn approached. "Come inside, both of you. We'll have hot water, food. Then we can discuss what you've learned." Robb followed them into the keep, where the familiar glow of lanterns cast dancing shadows across the corridors. Servants bustled, bringing news that Edmure awaited him in the solar. They paused just long enough for Robb to shed his damp cloak and rinse his hands. Sansa hovered near, as though reluctant to let him out of her sight. He gave her a gentle look. "You've grown braver, Sansa. Mother told me how you've helped the refugees." She lowered her eyes. "It was the least I could do. Those poor people. Sometimes I think about how I once wished to be a queen, to live in a grand palace. And now, I just want this to end." He nodded, pressing her hand softly before heading to his meeting with Edmure. Catelyn escorted them down a corridor lined with old Tully shields, each bearing fresh scars from recent usage. Edmure was at the table poring over maps. His face lifted as Robb entered, and a weary grin tugged at his mouth. "Welcome back. I see you've made the Lannisters dance in the mud." "More or less," Robb said, settling into a chair, "though they gave us some bruises in return." Catelyn poured wine into cups while Edmure explained that Tywin's second force had indeed established a foothold near Harrenhal, garrisoning the ruin under the mountain's command. That spelled renewed terror for the local peasants, but it also pinned many Lannister troops to that area. Tywin himself had not yet risked a march on Riverrun, possibly wary of being caught between the castle's defenders and Robb's roving host. "We may have forced him into a stalemate," Edmure mused, tapping the map. "But he has more men on the way, or so the rumors say. Our supply lines are adequate for now, but if he chooses a siege, we'll need more than cunning." Robb stared at the scattered tokens across the map, representing their forces and the Lannisters. "I need more information on Stannis and Renly. If one of them commits to an assault on King's Landing, Tywin won't be able to ignore it." Catelyn, sipping her wine, set the cup down with a quiet clank. "I received a raven from Storm's End just this morning. It's from a man claiming to speak for King Renly. He says Stannis has retreated to Dragonstone to rebuild his strength, while Renly remains at Highgarden with the Tyrells, gathering fresh troops. He's proposed a meeting." Edmure's eyebrows rose. "A meeting with Renly? Has the man given terms?" Catelyn shook her head. "Only that Renly might be willing to recognize the North's independence in exchange for our neutrality or a pledge not to aid Stannis. He's grown confident again with the might of the Tyrells behind him." Robb leaned forward, heart pounding with possibility. If Renly truly offers to grant the North independence, that's half of what we want. But can we trust him? Caitlyn's mouth twisted. Trust is in short supply, Robb. We'd need more than words. We'd need guarantees. Edmure frowned. And what about the Riverlands? Our families and allies hold fealty to the Tullus, who hold fealty to the king in the north now. Renly might want the Riverlands back under the Iron Throne if he wins. That's unacceptable. Robb set a fingertip on the map, tapping near the southwestern edges, where the Tyrell Rose might come into conflict with Lannister territories. At the very least, a meeting with Renly could keep him from allying with the Lannisters. If Renly marches on the capital, Tywin would be forced to choose between continuing the war here or rushing south to defend King's Landing. Caitlyn nodded slowly. Yet going to meet him or sending an envoy is a risk. Tywin could seize that chance to strike. Robb studied the table in grim silence. The war pulled from every side, alliances fracturing and reforming in constant motion. I'll consider it carefully, he said at last. For now, let's use the relative stalemate to strengthen our positions. We need to see that the Riverlands are defended, that Harrenhal remains as contained as possible, and that Tywin does not break our lines. Mother, if you would, please pen a cautious reply to Renly's envoy. We'll suggest a potential parley, but we must be wary. We've been burned by trusting the South before. They parted soon after, each weighed by the complexities of the struggle. Edmure left to oversee the castle's readiness. Caitlyn rose to check on Sansa. Robb lingered in the solar, gazing at the flicker of candlelight on the map. He touched the location where Harrenhal's token sat, thinking of the atrocities rumored under Gregor Clegane's watch, the cruel vengeance that might be exacted on any loyal Tully subject. A spark of fury lit in him. That torment had to end. Yet he could not sacrifice the entire war effort to retake a ruin that offered questionable advantage. Then his finger shifted north to the barrier of the Neck, where Winterfell and the rest of the north lay. He wondered if Theon Greyjoy had returned to the Iron Islands or if he still drifted, uncertain of his loyalties. He wondered if Balon Greyjoy was planning some cunning stroke. Anxiety threatened to well up, but he forced it down. One day at a time, he blew out the candle and stepped into the corridor. Grey wind appeared from a dim corner, padding at his side. In the gloom of night, the direwolf's eyes gleamed. Robb murmured, "Come, let's see if Sansa has retired. I should speak with her." They passed through hallways lit by sputtering torches. The hush of a war castle after dark lay over everything. Servants dozed in corners. A guard on patrol nodded to the king in the north. Outside Sansa's chamber, Robb paused and knocked softly. Caitlyn answered, stepping out. "She's resting," she said quietly. "I stayed until she fell asleep. The girl is exhausted in ways not easily healed by a single night's rest. She asked if you were safe. I told her you are, for now." Robb gave a tight smile. "I just wanted to reassure her." Caitlyn nodded, then glanced down the corridor, ensuring no one else lingered. "Robb, we are in the thick of it now. Tywin's men prowl at our doorstep. Gregor terrorizes the Riverlands. Renly extends a tempting hand that might hide a dagger, and the Ironborn remain poised to strike. I fear for you, for Sansa, for Arya. The weight on your shoulders. It's more than any boy your age should bear." He set a hand gently on her arm. "I'm no boy now, Mother. We're seized to that. I only hope I can steer our house safely through. Father's ghost haunts me each time I must choose cunning over open honesty." Her eyes glistened. "Your father was an honorable man, but even he was forced to bend at times for the good of his people. Honor is important, but so is wisdom. Don't forget that." He squeezed her hand. "Thank you." She left him then, returning to her own quarters, and Robb, with Grey Wind in tow, made his way slowly through the castle halls until he reached a small terrace overlooking the courtyard. The night air held a crisp chill. Stars sparkled in a wide, cloudless sky. He thought of Arya, somewhere out there in the vast realm, alone or perhaps in the company of strangers. Would she find her way back to them, or would the swirling chaos of war swallow her story? He prayed again, silently, to the old gods and the new, that his sister would endure. In the days that followed, Riverrun remained on constant watch, waiting for signs of Tywin's next move. Occasional reports arrived of raids or skirmishes near Harrenhal. Lord Bolton wrote from the north, stating that a handful of Ironborn ships had tested the defenses of Bear Island and Sea Dragon Point but were driven off. No major confrontation yet, but the tension thickened. Robb recognized that they were one cunning stroke away from catastrophe. Letters to and from Renly continued. The proposed parley was set for a site near Bitterbridge, though the distance and the risk of traveling through contested lands made it a challenge. Robb was torn between going in person, knowing that a personal meeting might carry more weight, and sending an envoy. In truth, he mistrusted Renly's ambition. But if Renly truly pledged to respect the North's freedom, that might be more than any Baratheon or Targaryen had ever granted. At length, after conferring with Catelyn, Brynden Tully, and a handful of trusted knights, Robb decided to dispatch his mother as his envoy. She had a sure hand for negotiation, and her Tully name might still command some respect in southern courts. He would remain in the Riverlands to guard against Tywin's armies. It was a difficult decision. He hated to part with his mother again, and Sansa fretted over the idea of Catelyn traveling so far in uncertain times. Yet Robb felt he must maintain leadership in the field. When Catelyn prepared to depart, a small retinue of loyal men and a few trusted lords joined her, including Ser Wendell Manderly, a knight from White Harbor known for his hardy spirit, and Mark Piper, a young river lord of adventurous bent. Sansa embraced her mother tearfully in the courtyard, though she tried to be brave, reminding herself that Lady Catelyn had once gone to treat with Renly before, after Ned's downfall. "Bring us good tidings," Sansa said, eyes brimming. "Perhaps Renly will truly help, and we can go home." Catelyn cradled her daughter's cheek, sadness in her smile. "I will do my best. Stay safe here with your brother, and keep to your kindness, Sansa. The realm sorely needs it." She mounted her horse and led her small group out of Riverrun, banners snapping in a cool breeze. Robb stood by Sansa's side, gray wind at his feet, watching until their mother's party vanished into the distance. The day felt emptier at once. Within the week, Tywin's stirrings resumed in earnest. Reports indicated he had summoned the mountain back from Harrenhal for a possible push toward the crossroads, perhaps aiming to break the supply lines feeding Riverrun. Robb responded by sending out the Great John and Rickard Karstark again, each with a contingent of riders. They were to harass the Lannisters, replicate the earlier campaign of disruption. The lines of war were drawn once more, men marching out beneath stormy skies, the Riverlands destined for more blood. In this swirl of tension, Sansa occupied herself assisting in the healing ward, where wounded men from recent skirmishes were treated by Maester Vyman and a few local healers. Edmure Tully often visited as well, checking on his knights. Sansa found it harrowing to see so many battered bodies, missing limbs or covered in burns and sword cuts. She forced herself not to flinch, to help with bandages, to bring water or speak soothing words. In doing so, she discovered a new reservoir of fortitude, a determination to do some small good amid the madness. Sometimes, as she worked, she recalled being forced to watch Joffrey punish knights or humiliate petitioners in King's Landing, and she would tremble with anger or shame. She had once admired that boy, believed him charming. How naive she had been. Seeing real suffering now taught her that cruelty was never truly admirable. Compassion, however quiet, was the braver choice. Robb watched her growth with a bittersweet pride. War was forging them all in flame. He oversaw the castle's defenses, arranged new scouting routes, tried to prepare for the worst. When he slept, which was seldom, his dreams swirled with images of father and sisters, of dire wolves chasing golden lions through endless snow. Often he woke in a sweat, listening for the footstep of a messenger who might bring dire news. As the nights lengthened, the first rumors of early frosts in the north trickled down. Winter was indeed coming, though how soon or how harshly, no one could say. Robb worried about the harvest in the Riverlands. If the fighting ruined too many fields, the small folk would starve. Tywin's men, unconcerned with the cost, torched farmland to weaken the Tully supply lines. Another reason to end this war as swiftly as possible, though that seemed a distant hope. A messenger arrived from Catelyn some weeks later, having braved many perils to reach Riverrun. She had made it to Bitterbridge, only to learn that Renly had moved on, traveling to Highgarden for some grand tournament to celebrate his new alignment with Mace Tyrell. The letter indicated she was chasing him through the Reach, seeking a parley wherever he would stand still. So far, no definitive negotiation had taken place, though Renly's courtiers spoke of generosity and potential alliance. "Renly desires a grand show," Robb muttered after reading the letter in the hall. "He fancies himself the rightful king with the Tyrells' backing, but he only offers honeyed words. I wonder if he truly intends to commit to helping us, or if he just wants to keep us from aiding Stannis." Sansa, who stood by, voiced a quiet question. "If Renly cannot be trusted, what will we do?" Robb exhaled. "Continue as we have. The North can rely only on itself. If Renly demands we bend the knee, that's no better than Joffrey. So I won't do it. The question is whether we can broker terms that let us focus on Tywin without fear of an attack from the south." The days that followed were bleak. More wounded arrived. A small party of Lannister soldiers actually approached Riverrun's walls one misty morning, calling for a parley. Robb, suspicious, rode out with a small honor guard, meeting them in a field near the castle. The Lannister spokesman, a knight with harsh blue eyes, demanded that Robb surrender the Riverlands and come to King's Landing in chains to answer for his crime of kidnapping Joffrey. Robb's laughter was cold. The conversation ended with threats exchanged. By midday, the Lannisters had withdrawn, the ephemeral notion of a peaceful talk snuffed out. In quiet intervals, Robb tried to give Sansa his time. He listened to her stories of caring for the wounded, of writing letters to old friends she'd known in the capital. Sometimes they would walk along the ramparts, recalling memories of Winterfell. She told him of a day when she was small, trailing after their mother as Catelyn walked the battlements in a summer storm. Sansa had been frightened of the lightning. Their mother had soothed her by reciting a lullaby. The memory brought tears to her eyes. "War is like a perpetual thunderstorm," Sansa said softly, "always rumbling, never gone. But if we endure it, maybe the sun will come again." Robb managed a small smile. "You've grown wise, sister." "I've grown tired," she corrected gently. They shared a moment of understanding. He had not mentioned Arya again, not wanting to torment Sansa with the uncertain fate of their younger sister, but he could tell it weighed on her. Each time the ravens arrived, she asked if there was any word, though there never was. Then, on a chill afternoon, a new arrival sent a shiver of upheaval through Riverrun's gates. A band of riders from the Westerlands, battered and exhausted, approached under a white banner of truce, escorted by Tully outriders. Among them was Cleos Frey, nephew to Lord Walder Frey and cousin to the Lannisters by marriage. He bore a letter sealed with the lion crest, a letter that he claimed came directly from Tywin Lannister. The letter offered a negotiation of hostages, a potential exchange to end some of the violence, or so it claimed. Robb read the parchment in silence, lips tightening at each line. Tywin recognized the Riverlands as a contested territory, expressed a willingness to free certain captive Tully bannermen if House Stark would release certain Lannister knights taken in skirmishes. But nowhere did he speak of acknowledging the North's independence, nor did he mention Sansa. The letter ended with the usual threats. If House Stark refused, then Tywin would unleash full retribution. Edmure scowled at the terms. "He offers trifles, expecting us to kneel." Robb looked up at Cleos Frey, who stood meekly in the hall. "You're Walder Frey's kin. Does Lord Frey endorse this message?" Cleos swallowed. "My Lord Grandfather is aware of it, but it is truly from Lord Tywin. He means to see if there is any chance of a settlement. He says the realm bleeds, and the only remedy is your surrender." A bitter laugh escaped Robb. "Surrender, of course. And if we kneel to Joffrey, what becomes of the father he beheaded? And the sister we traded for that monstrous boy? No, the Lannisters will not broker a fair peace." Cleos's face was pale, sweat beading on his brow. "My lord," I only carry the words. I beg you not to kill the messenger." Robb handed the letter to Edmure. "You're free to stay the night in Riverrun, Cleos, but I fear your mission is doomed. Tell Tywin Lannister that the North will not kneel. Not as long as I live." Cleos bowed stiffly, relief flickering across his features. "I'll convey your words, your grace. May the gods have mercy on us all." So it went. Robb penned a curt reply, refusing Tywin's conditions, reasserting his own demands: acknowledgement of northern independence, withdrawal of Lannister forces from the Riverlands, restitution for the harm done to Tully vassals, and respect for the Tully lord's fealty to the king in the north. In short, everything Tywin would never accept. After Cleos departed, escorted by a fresh retinue, the mood in Riverrun grew tauter. Winter's approach could be felt in the crisp morning air, in the earlier dusk. Men wondered if Tywin might attempt a final grand offensive before the year's end, or if he would wait out the cold. Robb's outriders caught murmurs that Lannister foragers were scouring villages for grain, an ominous sign. One gray morning, a messenger from the Neck arrived, bringing a letter from Roose Bolton's forces. It confirmed that the Ironborn had ramped up their raids on the northern coasts. Reports of savage attacks on fishing hamlets near the stony shore. Rumors that Theon Greyjoy himself led some of these strikes. Robb felt a spike of anger and betrayal. He had thought of Theon as a friend once, a brother in all but blood. That night, as the wind howled beyond the walls, he spoke with Sansa by the hearth. She saw the tension in his posture. "What's wrong?" He stared into the flames, the letter still clenched in his hand. "Theon is raiding the north. They're calling it Balon Greyjoy's renewed rebellion. I should have listened to my instincts before letting him go. He offered to broker an alliance with his father, but that was a gamble. Theon was too eager to prove himself. It seems the Greyjoys have sided against us." Sansa's expression grew pained. "Oh, Robb, I'm sorry. I know you were fond of him once." He let out a shaky breath. "He was my friend, lived with us, trained with us. But apparently his loyalty to his father was stronger." "It's not your fault," she whispered. "You trusted him. You believed in loyalty. Isn't that how father raised us? To honor those who shared our hearth?" Robb shut his eyes. "Yes, but war twists men's loyalties, or reveals them for the illusions they are." He thought of the north, of White Harbor, Deepwood Motte, Torrens Square, all the holds that might now be threatened. He clenched his fists, feeling rage at the knowledge he was pinned far to the south, forced to contend with Lannisters while the Ironborn struck at his home. The largest part of the northern army was still in the Riverlands, or scattered among the battles. Could Roose Bolton alone repel the Ironborn? If not, Winterfell itself could be in danger. That specter robbed him of sleep. He paced the corridors deep into the night, wrestling with the possibility that he might have to march home, leaving the Riverlands to fend for itself. That would be a betrayal of House Tully, of his mother's heritage, and of the lords who had declared him king in the north. Tywin would exploit that vacuum in the Riverlands, potentially smashing Edmure's defenses. Then, too, if Robb left, the Lannisters might slip into the Neck behind him, cutting off supply lines, devastating the region. By dawn, he felt no closer to a resolution. The war had become a hydra, sprouting new threats wherever he turned. He called a council that day. Edmure insisted that if the north was threatened, Robb must do what was best for his own seat. "We Tullis will manage here. We'll hold Riverrun," Edmure said, though lines of worry creased his face. "But I fear you might lose the north if you wait too long. Winterfell is the heart of your kingdom." Rickard Karstark, who had come back from a raid, agreed. "My sons died fighting for this cause, but I'll not see the Greyjoys defile our homeland. Let's ride north, your grace. Let Tywin sit in Harrenhal counting crows." But Brynden Tully counseled caution. "If you leave the Riverlands in force, Tywin may sense weakness and strike. Harrenhal is not so far from Riverrun. Edmure's garrison is strong, but is it strong enough to resist a determined siege? And what if the Greyjoy threat is not as dire as it seems? Raiding the coasts is not the same as seizing Winterfell." Robb sat in silence, hearing each viewpoint, He glanced at Sansa, who had begged to sit in, hoping to glean any news of the north that might hint at Arya's location. She offered no opinion. She simply looked frightened by the scope of decisions. Eventually, Robb rose. "We must keep pressing Tywin. If he sees us withdraw, he'll push deeper into the Riverlands. The war cannot be won by ceding ground. I'll send additional riders north, with instructions for Lord Bolton. We'll see if the Manderleys can spare men to fortify the coasts. If the situation grows dire, we'll reassess. But for now, we hold the line." Karstark's brow furrowed, unhappy but grudgingly accepting. Brynden Tully nodded, though he looked far from complacent. Edmure seemed relieved, but also worried about the possibility of a pincer. Tywin in the south, the Ironborn in the north. So the dance continued. Scouts reported that Tywin was slowly pushing east, building small forts and outposts. Gregor's men circled Harrenhal, scorching farmland. Robb responded with more of the same harrying tactics, a cat-and-mouse game that turned each muddy road into a potential battlefield. The shrieks of ravens overhead became as constant as the clash of steel. More refugees fled to Riverrun, and Sansa continued her quiet ministrations. She had found a certain purpose in comforting children orphaned by the raids, telling them gentle stories of the north. Edmure and the Tully men thanked her politely, though they, like everyone else, were too consumed by war to express more than fleeting gratitude. Yet she persevered, day after day, ignoring her own tears to wipe those of others. One evening, Robb found her standing by the ramparts at twilight, the wind lifting her auburn hair. Below them, the red fork sparkled in the last rays of sun. She turned when she heard his footsteps. "They say you raided another Lannister supply caravan near Pink Maiden," she said, her voice subdued. "Men are calling you the young wolf, a cunning commander." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Let them call me what they like, so long as it helps our cause." She peered at him. "Are you proud? I would think it's an honor to be so respected by your men." He gazed out at the horizon. "Sometimes I am proud, but mostly I'm tired. Each time I plan a raid, I think of the men who will die in it, or the men who might be butchered if we fail. Father always said a lord who passes a death sentence should swing the sword himself. War is like passing 1,000 death sentences." Sansa's eyes reflected sadness and understanding. "I wish it weren't so, but the Lannisters, after what they did in King's Landing, I can't pretend they'd ever show mercy." He nodded, remembering Ned's death, her captivity, the cruelty that radiated from Joffrey. "No, we have to stand. But I do hope that one day this is over, that we can go home. You, me, Mother, Arya if the gods are kind, and even Bran and Rickon." He trailed off, thinking of his younger brothers in Winterfell. How had they fared with the Ironborn raids? A pang of worry seized him, another threat lurking in the back of his mind. Sansa placed a hand on his arm. "You're doing all you can. Father would be proud." He sighed. "I hope so." They stood there a while longer, letting the last sliver of daylight fade into violet dusk. The clang of the portcullis signaled a patrol returning. Tomorrow would bring fresh orders, fresh plans, and possibly fresh bloodshed. Still, for that moment, at least, brother and sister shared a fragile peace on the castle walls, the wind carrying the tang of the river and the echoes of distant thunder. Weeks turned into months, creeping toward the close of that tumultuous year. The fighting continued in fits and starts, neither side delivering a crushing blow. Tywin's host remained a looming menace, but the Northmen's hit-and-run tactics and the Riverlord's fierce defense stalled him. Harrenhal stood as a malignant fortress under Gregor's command, from which forays of brutal men terrorized outlying villages. Riverrun, though never directly besieged, held a siege's tension, always bracing for the next hammerfall. Letters from Catelyn came in frequently, but the last one mentioned that Renly had again postponed a proper meeting, claiming pressing matters in Highgarden. The Tyrells were preparing for some large-scale movement, presumably to threaten King's Landing. Yet details were scarce. The letter's tone was one of frustration. Lady Catelyn doubted Renly's sincerity, suspecting he only wanted to keep House Stark neutral until he consolidated power. Another letter from Roose Bolton at the Dreadfort indicated the Ironborn had seized several northern castles along the coast and might be marching inland. The news made Robb's hands shake with fury. He pictured Theon Greyjoy leading men into the heart of his childhood home. So far, no direct assault on Winterfell had been reported, but rumors circulated. The letter ended with a note that Roose was preparing a counterattack. "Pray for the North," Bolton wrote in his careful, emotionless script. And so, one harsh morning, Robb came to a decision that would alter the shape of the war yet again. He summoned Edmure, Brynden Tully, and Rickard Karstark to the Solar. Sansa, as always, was not formally included, but she lingered near, sensing something significant. Robb placed his hands on the table, where the battered map of the Trident lay, corners curled from the damp. "We can't continue fighting a war on two fronts. The Ironborn have grown bold. I won't lose the North while we're stuck in this stalemate. We must break Tywin's hold on the Riverlands, or force him to retreat, so I can march home." Edmure's face was grave. "That means a decisive strike. But Tywin has more men, better armor. If we attack directly, it may be suicidal." Brynden Tully stroked his grizzled beard. "There may be a way. We know the land, we control certain fords. If we concentrate our forces cleverly, we might cut him off from his supply lines, or force a pitched battle on ground we choose." Rickard Karstark nodded. "We can call in the lords loyal to House Tully, gather at least a few thousand men. Along with your Northmen, that might give us a chance." Robb's gaze roamed over them. "It's risky, but letting this drag on is riskier. Every day the Ironborn burn the North. My family seat is threatened." Edmure laid a hand on Robb's wrist. "We Tullis will not fail you. My father always said the Riverlands are the shield of the North. If this is what it takes to let you defend Winterfell, so be it. We shall rally." A plan took shape that very day. Robb would gather the scattered Northmen who had been harrying Tywin, recall some of his lords from the outlying areas, and combine them with Edmure's main host. The Greatjon, Karstark, Mallister, Blackwood, Bracken, and other lesser lords would muster for a unified strike. They would choose the battlefield carefully, aiming to lure Tywin into a disadvantageous position, perhaps a ford with marshy ground that would hamper the Lannister cavalry. If they could defeat him in a single decisive clash, or at least bloody him enough that he retreated, Robb could then march the majority of his forces north to drive out the Ironborn. That evening, Sansa heard rumors swirling among the men. The king in the north would soon confront Tywin Lannister in open battle. Some spoke with eager ferocity. Finally, a chance to end the Lion's threat. Others muttered caution, recalling the Lannisters' cunning and the potential for disaster. She cornered Robb in the courtyard, voice trembling. "Is it true? You're going to meet him in a pitched battle?" Robb nodded, exhaustion etched in every line of his face. "We have no choice. The war can't linger forever. If we can't break Tywin, the North may be lost to the Ironborn." Sansa clutched his hand. "Then let me pray for you. Please be careful, Robb." He drew her into a quick embrace, ignoring the glances from passing guards. "I will, sister. I promise I'll do everything I can to survive. And hopefully after this we can go home." Within days, Riverrun bustled with preparations. Arrows were fletched by the thousands, swords sharpened, horses fed and groomed. Men arrived in small columns, bearing the sigils of houses sworn to Tully or Stark, some battered from skirmishes, others fresh. Tents sprouted in the fields around the castle. The Greatjon's booming laughter mixed with Rickard Karstark's grim orders. Brynden Tully, calm and watchful, circulated among the troops. Edmure oversaw the provisioning. On the appointed morning, Robb donned his armor, polished steel with the dire wolf of Stark on the breast. Sansa helped fasten the buckles, her hands trembling. He carried his sword at his hip, near the stable, Grey Wind paced restlessly. The host assembled in the courtyard with a thunder of hooves and a clatter of metal. Banners rippled in the breeze, some new, some stained from months of fighting. Sansa stood on the steps with Edmure Tully, who would remain behind to guard Riverrun. Her eyes brimmed with unshed tears as she watched Robb mount his horse. He caught her gaze and inclined his head in a gesture of reassurance. She lifted a hand in farewell, lips pressed tight. Trumpets sounded, horns echoing off the walls. The drawbridge rattled down, and the king in the north led his men out into the wide, war-torn land. Ahead lay the final gamble to break Tywin's hold, to secure the Riverlands, and to free the north from the Ironborn threat. If they succeeded, the tide might finally turn in their favor. If they failed, the realm could see House Stark's light snuffed out, leaving only the memory of a captured boy king and a too brief moment when the wolves had shown their teeth. They rode into a dawn streaked with red and gold, as though the sky itself bled. The war drums pounded in the hearts of men, and the ground shook with their passage. In her mind, Sansa prayed fervently, to every god she knew, that her brother would return victorious, and that when the ravens flew from that battlefield, the north would remain unbroken. The future was unwritten, waiting like a blank page for the stroke of steel, the cry of horns, and the unstoppable footsteps of fate. Yet in that moment, the king in the north rode forward with fierce determination, the memory of his father's honor guiding him, his sister's hope fueling him, and the dream of a free north burning in his soul. And high above, crows circled in the early light, harbingers of war, watchers over the savage game that was about to reach its next fearsome crescendo.